The Tale of Genji, Chapter 4. Yugao. It was at the time when he was secretly visiting the lady of the Sixth Ward. One day on his way back from the palace, he thought that he would call upon his foster mother, who, having long been very ill, had become a nun. She lived in the Fifth Ward. After many inquiries, he managed to find the house, but the front gate was locked, and he could not drive in. He sent one of his servants for Koremitsu, his foster nurse's son, and while he was waiting, began to examine the rather wretched-looking by-street. The house next door was fenced with a new paling, above which at one place were 4 or 5 panels of open trills work, screened by blinds which were very white and bare. Through chinks in these blinds a number of foreheads could be seen. They seemed to belong to a group of ladies, who must be peeping with interest into the street below. At first he thought that they had merely peeped out as they passed, but he soon realized that if they were standing on the floor, they must be giants. No, evidently they had taken the trouble to climb onto some table or bed, which was surely rather odd. He had come in a plain coach, with no outriders. No one could possibly guess who he was, and feeling quite at his ease, he leaned forward and deliberately examined the house. The gate, also made of a kind of trills work, stood ajar, and he could see enough of the interior to realize that it was very humble and a poorly furnished dwelling. For a moment he pitied those who lived in such a place, but then he remembered the song, "Seek not in the wide world to find a home, but where you chance to rest, call that your house." And again, monarchs may keep their palaces of jade, for in a leafy cottage two can sleep. There was a wattled fence over which some ivy-like creeper spread its cool green leaves, and among the leaves were little white flowers with petals half unfolded like the lips of people, smiling at their own thoughts. "They are called Yugao, or evening faces," one of his servants told him. "How strange to find so lovely a crowd clustered on this deserted wall." And indeed, it was a most strange and delightful thing to see how, on the narrow tenement in a poor quarter of the town, they had clambered over rickety eaves and gables, and spread wherever there was room for them to grow. He sent one of his servants to pick some, and the man entered at the half-open door, and had begun to pluck the small flowers, when a little girl in a long yellow tunic came through a quite genteel sliding door, and holding out towards Genji's servant a small white fan, heavily perfumed with incense, she spoke to him. "Would you like something to put them on? I'm afraid you have chosen a wretched-looking bunch." And she handed him the fan. And just as he was opening the gate on his way back, the old nurse's son, Koremitsu, came out of the other house, full of apologies for having kept Genji waiting for so long. "I could not find the key of the gate," he said. "Fortunately, the people of this humble quarter are not likely to recognize you, and to press or stare. But I am afraid you must have been very much bored waiting in this hugger-mugger back street." And he conducted Genji into the house. Koremitsu's brother, the deacon, his own brother-in-law, Mikiwa no Kami, and his sister all assembled to greet the prince, delighted by a visit with which they had not thought he was ever likely to honor them again. The nun, too, rose from her couch. "For a long time I have been waiting to give up the world, but one thing held me back. I wanted you to see your old nurse just once again, as you used to know her. You never came to see me, and at last I gave up waiting, and I took my vow. Now, in reward for the penances which my order enjoins, I have got back a little of my health. And having seen my dear young master again, I can wait with a quiet mind for the Lord Amida's light." And in her weakness she shed a few tears. "I heard some days ago," said Genji, "that you were very dangerously ill, and was in great anxiety. It is sad now to find you in this penitent garb. You must live longer yet, and see me rise in the world, that you may be born again high in the ninth sphere of Amida's paradise. For they say that those who died with longings unfulfilled are burdened with evil karma in their life to come." People such as old nurses regard even the most blackguardly and ill-favored foster child as prodigies of both beauty and virtue. Small wonder then if Genji's nurse, who had played so great a part in his early life, always regarded her office as immensely honorable and important, and tears of pride came into her eyes while he spoke to her. The old lady's children thought it very improper that their mother, having already taken holy orders, should show so lively an interest in any human career. Certain that Genji himself would be very much shocked, they exchanged uneasy glances. He was on the contrary deeply touched. When I was a child, he said, those who were dearest to me were early taken away. And although there were many who gave a hand to my upbringing, it was to you only, dear nurse, that I was deeply and tenderly attached. When I grew up, I could not any longer be often in your company. I have not even been able to come here and see you as often as I would want. But in all the long time which has passed since I was last here, I have thought a great deal about you, and wished that life did not force so many bitter partings upon us. So he spoke tenderly. The princely scent of the sleeve, which he had raised to brush away his tears, filled the low and narrow room, and even the young people, who had till now been irritated by their mother's obvious pride at having been the nurse of so splendid a prince, found themselves moved to tears. Having arranged for continual masses to be said on this sick woman's behalf, he then took his leave, ordering Koremitsu to light him with a candle. As they left the house, he looked at the fan upon which the white flowers had been laid, and now saw that there was writing on it, a poem carelessly but quite elegantly scribbled. The flower that puzzles you was but the yagao, strange beyond knowing in its dress of shiny dew. It was written with a deliberate negligence which seemed to aim at concealing the writer's status and identity, but for all that the hand showed a breeding and distinction which agreeably surprised him. Who lives at the house on the left? He asked Koremitsu, who did not at all want to act as a go-between. He replied that he had been at his mother's for 5 or 6 days, and had been so much very occupied by her illness that he had not asked any questions about the neighbors. Oh, I only want to know for quite a harmless reason, said Genji. There's something about this fan which raises a rather important point. I positively must settle it. You would oblige me by making inquiries from someone who knows this neighborhood. Koremitsu went at once to the house next door, and sent for their steward. This house, the man said, belongs to a certain titular prefect. He is living in the country, but my lady is still here, and as she is young and loves company, her brothers, who are in service at the court, often come here to visit her. And that is about all one can expect a servant to know, said Koremitsu, when he repeated this information. It occurred at once to Genji that it was one of these courtiers who had written the poem. Yes, there was certainly a self-confident air in the writing. It was by someone whose rank entitled him to have a good opinion of himself. But he was romantically disposed. It was too painful to dismiss altogether the idea that, after all, the verses might really have been meant for him. And on the folded paper he wrote, Could I but get a closer view, no longer would they puzzle me, the flowers that all too dimly in the gathering dusk I saw. This he wrote in a disguised hand, and gave to his own servant. The man reflected that though the sender of the fan had never seen Genji before, yet so well known were his features that even the glimpse they had got from the window might easily have revealed to them his own identity. He could imagine the excitement with which the fan had been dispatched, and the disappointment when for so long a time no answer came. His somewhat rudely belated arrival would seem to them to have been purposely contrived. They would all be agog to know what was in the reply, and he felt very nervous as he approached the house. Meanwhile, lighted only by a dim torch, Genji quietly left his nurse's home. The blinds of the other house were now drawn, and only the firefly glimmer of a candle shone through the gap between. When he reached his destinations, a very different scene met his eyes. A handsome park, a well-kept garden. How spacious and comfortable it all was. And soon the magnificent owner of the splendor had driven from his head all thought of the wooden paling, the shutters, and the flowers. He stayed longer than he intended, and the sun was already up when he set out for home. Again he passed the house with the shutters. He had driven through the quarter countless times without taking the slightest interest in it, but that one small episode of the fan had suddenly made his daily passage through these streets an event of great importance. He looked about him eagerly, and would have liked to know who lived in all the houses. For several days Koremitsu did not present himself at Genji's palace, but when at last he came, he explained that his mother was growing much weaker, and it was very difficult for him to ever get away. Then, drawing nearer, he said in a low voice, "I made further inquiries, but could not find out much. It seems that someone came very secretly in June and has been living there ever since. But who she really is not even her own servants know. I have once or twice peeped through a hole in the hedge and caught a glimpse of some young woman, but their skirts were rolled back and tucked into their belts, so I think that they must have been waiting maids. Yesterday, somewhere after sunset, I saw a lady writing a letter. Her face was calm, but she looked very unhappy, and I noticed that some of her women were secretly weeping." Genji was now more curious than ever. Though his master was of a rank which brought with it great responsibilities, Korematsu knew that in view of his youth and popularity, the young prince would be thought to be positively neglecting his duty if he did not indulge in a few escapades, and that everyone would regard his conduct as perfectly natural and proper, even when it was such as they would not have dreamed of permitting to the ordinary people. Hoping to get a little further information, he said, I found an excuse for communicating with her, and received in reply a very well-worded answer in a cultivated hand. She must be a girl of quite good position. Oh, you must find out more, said Genji. I shall not be happy till I know all there is to know about her. Here, perhaps, was just such a case as they had imagined on that rainy night. A lady whose outward circumstances seemed to place her in the lowest class, which they had agreed to dismiss as of no interest, but who in her own person showed qualities that were by no means despicable. But return for a moment to Utsumetsu. Her unkindness had not affected him as it would have affected most people. If she had encouraged him, he would soon have regarded the affair as an appalling indiscretion, which he must put an end to at all costs, whereas now he brooded continually upon his defeat, and was forever plotting new ways to shake her own resolve. He had never, till the day of his visit to the foster nurse, been interested in anyone of quite the common classes. But now, since the rainy night's conversation, he had explored, so it seemed to him, every corner of society, including in his survey even those categories which his friends had passed over as utterly remote and improbable. He thought of the lady who had, so to speak, been thrown into his life as an extra, with how confiding an air she had promised that she would wait. He was very sorry about her, but he was afraid that if he wrote to her, Utsumetsu might find out, and that would prejudice his chances. He would write to her afterwards. Suddenly at this point, Ionosuke himself was announced. He had just returned from his province, and had lost no time in paying his respects to the prince. The long journey by boat had made him look rather swarthy and quite haggard. Really, thought Genji, he is not at all an attractive man. Still, it was possible to talk to him, for if a man is of decent birth and breeding, however broken he may be by age or misfortune, he will always retain a certain refinement of mind and manners which prevent him from becoming merely repulsive. They were beginning to discuss the affairs of Iyo province, and Genji was even joking with him, when a sudden feeling of embarrassment came over him. Why should those recollections make him feel so awkward? Ionosuke was quite an old man. It had done him no harm. These scruples are absurd, thought Genji. However, she was right in thinking it was too queer, too ill-assorted a match, and remembering Uma no Kami's warnings, he felt that he had behaved badly. Though her unkindness still deeply wounded him, he was almost glad for Iyo's sake that she had not relented. My daughter is to be married, Iyo was saying, and I am going to take my wife back with me to my province. Oh, here was a double surprise. At all costs, he must now see Utsumetsu again. He spoke with her brother, and the boy discussed the matter with her. It would have been difficult enough for anyone to have carried on an intrigue with the prince under such circumstances as these. But for her, so far below him in rank, and beset by new restrictions, it had now become quite unthinkable. She could not, however, bear to lose all contact with him. And not only did she answer his letters much more kindly than before, but took pains, though they were written with apparent negligence, to add little touches that would give him pleasure, and make him see that she did still care for him. All this he noticed, and thought he was vexed that she would not relent towards him. He did find it impossible to put her out of his mind. As for the other girl, he did not think that she was at all the kind of person to go on pining for him once she was properly settled with a husband, and he now felt quite happy about her. It was autumn, and Genji had brought so many complications into his little life that he had for some reason, and for some while, been very irregular in his visits to the great hall, and he was in great disgrace there. The lady in the grand mansion was very difficult to get on with, but he had summoned so many obstacles in his courtship of her that to give her up the moment he had won her seemed quite absurd. Yet he could not deny that the blind, intoxicating passion which possessed him while she was still unattainable had almost disappeared. To begin with, she was far too sensitive. Then there was the disparity of their ages, and the constant dread of discovery which haunted him during those painful partings at the small hours of the morning. In fact, there were far too many disadvantages. It was a morning when mist lay heavy over the garden, and after being many times roused, Genji at last came out of Rikoju's room. Looking very cross and sleepy, one of the maids lifted part of the folding shutter, seeming to invite her mistress to watch the prince's departure. Rikujo pulled aside the bed curtains, and tossing her hair back over her shoulder, looked out into the garden. So many lovely flowers were growing in the border that Genji halted for a while to enjoy them. How beautiful he looked, standing there, she thought. As he was nearing the portico, the maid who had opened the shutters came and walked by his side. She wore a light green skirt exquisitely matched to the season and place. It was so hung as to show the great advantages, the grace, and suppleness of her stride. Genji looked down at her. "Let us sit down for a minute, in the railing here in the corner," he said. She seems very shy, he thought, but how charmingly her hair falls about her shoulders. And he recited the poem. Though I would not be thought to wander heedlessly from flower to flower, yet this morning's pear convolvulus I fain would pluck. As he said the lines, he took her hand, and she answered with practised ease. You hasten, I observe, to admire the morning flowers, while the mist still lies about them. Thus parrying the compliment by a verse which might be understood either in personal or general sense. At this moment a very elegant page, wearing the most bewitching of baggy trousers, came among the flowers, brushing the dew as he walked, and he began to pick a bunch of the convolvula. Genji longed to paint the scene. No one could see them without pleasure. He was like the flowering tree, under whose shade even the rude mountain peasant delights to rest. And so great was the fascination he exercised that those who knew him longed to offer him whatever was dearest to them. One who had a favorite daughter would ask for nothing better than to make her Genji's handmaiden. Another who had no exquisite sister was ready for her to serve in his household, though it was at the most menial of tasks. Still less could these ladies, who on such occasion as this were privileged in converse with him, and stare at him as much as they pleased, and were moreover young people of such sensibility, how could they fail to delight in this company, and note with such uneasiness that his visits were becoming far less frequent than before? But where have I got to? Ah, yes, Koremitsu has presently continued the inquiry with which Genji entrusted him. Who the mistress is, he said, I have not been able to discover, and for the most part she is at great pains not to ever show herself. But more than once in the general confusion, when there was the sound of a carriage coming along past the great row of tenement houses, when all the maidservants were peering out into the road, the young lady, whom I supposed to be the mistress of the house, slipped out along with them. I could not see her clearly, but she seemed to be very pretty. One day, seeing a carriage with outriders coming towards the house, one of the maids rushed off, calling out, Ukon, Ukon, come quickly and look. The captain's carriage is coming this way. At once a pleasant-faced lady, no longer young, came bustling out. Quickly, quickly, she held up her warning finger. How do you know it's the captain? I shall have to go and look. And she herself slipped out. A sort of rough drawbridge leads from the garden into the lane, and in her excitement the good lady caught her skirt in it, and falling flat on her face, almost tumbled into the ditch. A bad piece of work His Holiness of Katsurugi made here, she grumbled, but her curiosity did not seem to be at all dampened, and she stared harder than ever at the approaching carriage. The visitor was dressed in a plain white cloak. He had attendants with him, whose names the excited servant girls called out, as one after another they came near enough to be recognized. And the odd thing is that the names were certainly those of Tino Choji's grooms and pages. I must see that carriage for myself, said Genji. What if this should be the very lady whom Chujo, at the time of the rainy night's conversation, despaired of rediscovering? Koremitsu, noting that Genji was listening with particular attention, continued, I must tell you that I too have reason to be interested in this house, and while making inquiries on my own account, I discovered that the young lady always addresses the other girls in the house as though they were her equals. But when, pretending to be taken by this comedy, I began visiting there, I noticed that though the older ladies played their part very well, the young girls would every now and then let a curtsy or slip in a my lady without thinking, whereupon the others would hasten to cover up the mistake as best they could, saying anything that they would think of to make it appear that there was no mistress at all among them. And Koremitsu laughed as he recollected it.